Along with many of you, I remember when I was first introduced to the writings of Frederick Buechner, God rest his soul. I was first introduced to his nonfiction, where he was writing about his past and the tragedies that he had experienced, talking about how hard questions resist any simple answers. But then I was introduced to his fiction, which is just as widely acclaimed. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 1981. He's authored more than 30 books with constant success over the course of his career. But his first novel, in 1950, A Long Day's Dying, was almost not published. He had been working on the manuscript as a senior at Princeton, and he sent it off to a publisher in New York. The publisher sat down, read the manuscript from cover to cover, and then sent it back promptly with a very short note that simply said, "This manuscript is not publishable, and honestly, I can't think of anything that would even improve it." Later on in his career, looking back on that moment, he was unsure why that failure did not completely derail his career before it even got started. Later on, when he finally got the courage enough to send that manuscript off to another publisher, the response was different. He received a book deal. He saw the book come to life, and it received wide acclaim and wide success, so much so that that first publisher wrote him a second note, this time apologizing to him and asking for his forgiveness. When we think about success, we don't think about the hard road along the way. We never consider the failures. But so oftentimes, failure can become a gift. It can teach us something. It can call us to change. It can reveal something to us. As Caustica Bradenton says, failure has a bad rap, but it can be the most honest of friends. It doesn't flatter, doesn't make false promises, doesn't sell you unachievable goals. That we need to take failure seriously. And when we recall the story of David and Goliath, failure is the last thing on our minds. But as much as we learn from David's victory, we also learn from Goliath's defeat. It was during that time when the Philistines were threatening the Israelites. And David was just tending to his father's sheep at the time. 3 of his brothers were fighting alongside of King Saul, but David was not. And Goliath, standing there opposite of the Israelites, was the mere definition of a warrior. Tall, strong, big, well-trained. And he kept calling out the Israelites' best warrior to face him. And the 2 of them would fight, and whoever won would win the war. That either the Philistines would serve the Israelites or the Israelites would serve the Philistines. But Goliath was not just a capable fighter, but also a scare tactic. It was psychological warfare. You took one look at Goliath and you ran the other way. But one day, David's father sent him to bring food and encouragement to his brothers. And when he arrived there on the edge of the battlefield, he overheard Goliath's threats. And David decided to respond. But nobody thought this was a good idea. David insisted. He was going whether people approved of it or not. So they suited him up with all this armor, which was too heavy for his small frame. David decided just to take the tools that he used to defend his flock of sheep when they were vulnerable out in the wilderness. And oftentimes when we reread this story, we feel this need, this urge to build David up, to make him as strong as Goliath. I mean, he killed lions and bears. But the point of the story is that David was no match for Goliath. It was not a fair fight. When he stood in front of Goliath, Goliath sort of peered down at him, looking at David holding the shepherd's staff and saying in jest, "Am I a dog that you come before me with sticks?" You could almost hear the Philistines laughing over Goliath's shoulder. Despite being stronger and bigger, Goliath's failure reveals to us that so many times we misjudge what is true strength. There are not many artists as well known or successful as Vincent van Gogh. His pieces like The Starry Night, Irises, Sunflowers are on posters in bedrooms around the globe. His works of art are featured in every major art museum. You can't take an art history class where they don't talk about Van Gogh. But I wonder what he would have thought about his career. He created over 2,100 works of art, all of them sought after. But during his lifetime, he only sold one painting entitled The Red Vineyard. And it was to a friend, the sister of a fellow artist. But strangely enough, we find ourselves drawn more to his success after he died than before. That it's difficult to identify true strength, which is what we find in the psalm this morning as it is attributed to David. It does not proclaim the victory of success or the pursuit of recognition, that it reveals what perhaps we find in failure. That we are called to care for the oppressed, to tend to the afflicted, to care for the needy. Because the love of God moves towards the vulnerable. That is true strength. That even if we don't realize it, we might assume that to be strong is to be blessed. But we find something different in the life of Jesus. He is always moving towards the vulnerable. That like a physician, he comes for the sick, not those who are strong. That we discover and see and experience the love of Christ with the hurting. And when we look at all of these needs throughout the world, we cannot fix them all. But we can make small commitments that are faithful to God and to others. In 1854, Dr. John Snow was investigating an outbreak of cholera in London. It was an unknown disease at the time. It started in one particular neighborhood where in 3 days, 200 people died. In another week, 500 more people died. Everyone assumed that this disease was airborne, but Dr. Snow was skeptical. So he investigated it and tracked the origin to this single public well found on Broad Street in Soho that he determined the water was contaminated. So he goes to the local council and petitions and convinces them to just remove the handle of the pump, disabling the well. And it confirmed that the well was the source of the outbreak. People stopped getting sick. That the solution was just this small, basic action. We don't always have grand solutions to the world's problems. It is wonderful when we find those. But when we do not have them, we can still respond with small, faithful actions of compassion, generosity, and kindness. That we don't have to build David up to where he is as strong as Goliath. We have to recognize that it is a different kind of strength. That it is, as Samuel Wells writes, one of the most faithful things that we can do to be faithful to God and to others is simply to be with them. That we assume we've got to do something for someone. But before we do anything, we first need to be with them. That we are called to be with the vulnerable. Whether it is a child or young person, someone who is sick or aging, someone who is oppressed or dealing with the burdens of poverty, we need to be with them. Because most of what we need in this life is for someone to show up for us. Not just when we are hurting, but always. Because when someone shows up for us, they're not just there to help. They are there to be faithful to us. And we are called to be faithful to the vulnerable. Not just because we can care, not just because we can help, but first, because we care. Amen.